DIYers, what's going on? Mike Boards with the Mike Boards channel. Thank you for watching. Hey, we're talking boats today. We are transitioning from the greasable gimbal bearing inside our transom to the sealed gimbal bearing. We're going to talk about the service bulletin and the orientation of that yellow dot on the actual gimbal bearing. Let's take a look. All right, DIYers, at the Craftsman workstation, and as you can see on the left-hand side, we've been busy. The outdrive is fully rebuilt, and the entire workbench is filled with parts. Alpha 1 Gen 1 Mercruiser. All the schematics for the bell housing, gimbal ring, and transom, and we are following these to the T. And again, here are some old parts. However, coming to this part right here, Quicksilver set screw. Down below in the comment section as well as description section is a link on where to purchase this. And the sole purpose of this is to basically alleviate any possibility of a grease gun hooking up to that port and inserting grease into the passageway that feeds the grease to the gimbal bearing and the housing that it sits into. And DIYers, we are just shy from installing a brand new seal, which we don't need. This is the gimbal bearing grease seal. Again, we don't need this because we are transitioning to the newly designed sealed gimbal bearing. Now, for those of you that are not making that transition and are sticking with the standard and greasable gimbal bearing, well, down below in the comment section as well as description section will be links on how to remove that and install it. That's important. So I just wanted to show you that. What we'll do now is head to the computer and talk more about the service bulletin. However, real quick before we transition to the service bulletin, I cleaned up the table, and here is the Permalube or sealed gimbal bearing. And at the 10 o'clock, you can see that little dot or engravement. And this is a dummy gimbal bearing. And what I mean by that is I use this for videos. I'm not going to ever install this in a boat. And as you can see, the yellow dot is slightly faded. But a brand new gimbal bearing, that yellow dot will be very yellow. So I wanted to show you that again. There is no grease hole on the inner portion of the gimbal bearing and carrier. Here's the back side. Again, lubricated inside and sealed. All right, DIYers, we're on the computer now, and as you can see, the Mercruiser service bulletin, and this is bulletin number 2009-13 with an OEM number of 2009-08. And below that, you can see that it was circulated or sent to all service managers, technicians, and all part managers. And again, this is the service bulletin for the new Permalube gimbal bearing for Alpha and Bravo transoms, which, as you can see right here, are the models affected. So in the event that you have serial numbers that range from these numbers and above, whether it's an Alpha transom, a Bravo transom, C-Core, or Vaser, these are the serial numbers that you will reference. And below that is the situation. And again, Mercury and Mercruiser have transitioned away from the standard or original greasable gimbal bearing to the newly designed Permalube and sealed greased gimbal bearing. So again, the situation is as follows. Mercruiser transom assemblies are now equipped with a sealed, permanently lubricated, which is where that Permalube nickname comes from. Permalube is short for permanently lubricated gimbal bearing that does not require maintenance lubrication. Current production transoms use the Permalube gimbal bearing and do not require the grease fitting on the gimbal housing or the grease retention seal in front of the gimbal bearing. And just a little bit ago on our workstation, you saw our gimbal bearing grease seal. And long story short, in the event that you are transitioning from the older and standard greasable gimbal bearing to the newly designed Permalube gimbal bearing, you don't even have to do anything with that gimbal bearing grease seal that's already installed inside your transom behind of the gimbal bearing, or in other words, closest to the inboard engine or hull of the boat. In fact, you can leave it as is, because when you transition to the new Permalube gimbal bearing, that gimbal bearing grease seal no longer serves any purpose whatsoever. So I wanted to share that with you. In addition, the specified Permalube gimbal bearing is the replacement gimbal bearing type for all transoms. Replacement Permalube gimbal bearings come with a special plug, which have a new title name since this service bulletin was issued, and that is set screw, to replace the grease fitting. When replacing a lube-style gimbal bearing with a Permalube bearing, it is necessary to remove the grease fitting from the transom and install the special plug, which again is now called and titled set screw. Down below that, you can see ordering parts, and in relation whether you have an R, MR, Alpha 1, Early Alpha 1, Gen 2, and Early Bravo transoms. Here's the previous part number of the gimbal bearing, and here's the new part number. In addition, later Alpha 1, Gen 2, later Bravos, and Bravo X, XR, XZ transoms, as well as the Vaser transoms. Here it is, previous part number and our new part numbers. Down below that is the correction, which reads as follows. Remove the grease fitting from the starboard side of the gimbal housing. And here is a picture or image of the starboard side gimbal ring and the grease fitting that screws right into that indent or engraved portion of the gimbal ring. And again, in the event that you are transitioning from the old style gimbal bearing to the new Permaloop gimbal bearing, that original grease fitting must be removed and the brand new set screw must be installed. And I'll scroll down. This is page 1 of 4. There's a lot more info. We'll continue on. Here's page 2. And as you can see right here, we'll come up to number 2. Apply sealant to the threads of the grease passage plug, which again is now titled and called set screw. You will want to add perfect seal to this portion of the thread prior to screwing it inside the gimbal ring. And the reason for that is because this perfect seal will create an incredible and reliable watertight seal. And here's the part number down below in the comment section, as well as the description section will be a link on where to purchase that. In addition, down below, here's your tamper-resistant T20 bit. And DIYers, this is extremely important. This is not just your standard T20 bit. This is a tamper-resistant, or what a lot of people call this, is a securing bit. And what I mean by that is a standard T20 or T25, T30, whatever bit you're using in the standard torque set, it is a solid bit or tip. However, the tamper-resistant T20, or in other words, the securing bit, has a hole in the center portion right here. And directly below that, here is a head-on view of the tip portion of the T20 tamper-resistant bit. And there is the inner pin right there. So long story short, if you're trying to use a regular T20 bit that's a solid piece, there is no way you will ever be able to properly tighten or loosen this brand new set screw. Because again, it's got that inner pin right here that alleviates a regular or standard T20 bit from being allowed to loosen it or tighten it. And the main reason behind that is, well, security. Long story short, the engineers that designed the new Permaloop gimbal bearing and this brand new set screw wanted to alleviate any possibility of any licensed marine technician or DIYer from just assuming that there's an old or standard greasable gimbal bearing installed inside the transom. And they wanted to alleviate technicians or DIYers from unscrewing that set screw and pumping grease into the passageway all the way to the internal gimbal bearing. When again, the newly designed Permaloop and permanently sealed gimbal bearing no longer requires grease to be pumped into that passageway. So not only does that brand new set screw serve the purpose of the awareness to technicians as well as DIYers to not remove that set screw and pump grease into the system, it also informs you that there is a newly designed and Permaloop gimbal bearing installed inside the transom. So again, don't remove that set screw and don't pump grease into that system. And coming right here, the part number, I will also put that down below in the comment section as well as the description section. Let's continue on below that. Permaloop gimbal bearings. Important. When installing the gimbal bearing, the identifying dot on the gimbal bearing should be positioned at 10 o'clock as viewed from the stern. Again, extremely important. Why? Because that's how the engineers designed this, and installing it a different way will lead to premature failure, as well as the newly designed Permaloop gimbal bearing not performing as it was engineered and designed to do. I promise you that. And below that, you can see this note, and it reads as follows. Transom assemblies with Permaloop gimbal bearings do not require a grease retention seal, which I just talked about. Again, in the event that you're transitioning to that newly designed gimbal bearing, you don't need to do anything with that grease seal. You don't even have to remove it. However, back to the note, again, do not require a grease retention seal in front of the gimbal bearing. However, when installing a new Permaloop bearing, it is not necessary to remove the seal from transom that have the seal installed, as I literally just mentioned. Below that, a second note, refer to the appropriate MerCruiser service manual for gimbal bearing replacement instructions. And DIYers, that is extremely important. We are a firm believer anytime you are working on your boat, reference your exact serial number service manual, no other manual. And below that, identification, there is a note used on RMR Alpha 1 and Alpha 1 Gen 2 and Bravo transoms. And DIYers, this is the old or original style greasable gimbal bearing. As you can see here, here is the rotational inner race, and there is the hole for the grease to be pumped in the gimbal bearing. And at the 10 o'clock position, you just have a gray dot. It's not yellow, it's not red, it's not white, it's not blue, it's not green, it's just gray. And you've got the letter A and B. A is the center race and is the same on both sides, as you see here. The outer portion of the gimbal bearing, both front and back. And B, plain dot, which again is the greasable gimbal bearing. And I want to scroll down onto page 3, and here it is. We have the yellow dot on our gimbal bearing because, again, we are referencing our exact serial number service manual. And just like above, you've got A and B. However, notice there is no longer a hole right here for grease to be pumped into the gimbal bearing. It is sealed off. And the center race is the same on both sides. Again, the exact same as the older style gimbal bearing. However, the yellow dot now represents the Permaloop gimbal bearing. And again, 10 o'clock it has to be installed, positioned, and driven in place of the transom appropriately for that yellow dot to be placed at the 10 o'clock position. And we will come down. Here is a red dot. Let's read about this one. This is important. The gimbal bearing inner race thickness changed to accommodate the larger U-joint used in the X, XZ, and XR Bravo drives. If an X, XZ, or XR drive is installed on a transom with the thicker gimbal bearing, interference will occur between the U-joint and the bearing. Either one or both components will fail. And in other words, the engineers are being blatantly honest with you. Do not make that mistake or it will fail. So again, here is A. You can see right here, referencing A over here, 0.090 remove for Bravo X, XR, and XZ drives. And the letter B is referencing the red dot. And check this out. This is a greasable gimbal bearing, and there is the hole. However, as we continue down, if you've got the Bravos, you want to pay close attention to the newly designed Permalube gimbal bearing. Again, the letter A references the 0.090 remove for Bravo X, XR, and XZ drives. However, the dot, as referenced with the letter B, is white. It's not red as shown here. Again, the red represents the older style and greasable gimbal bearing, and the white dot, shown right there, represents the Permalube or newly designed gimbal bearing. And we'll scroll down on to page 4, and now we've got a green dot and a white dot as you see here, and these are used on the Vaser transoms. And just like the Bravos, you've got that letter A, and it references the change of 0.090 removed from Vaser transom. And the green dot will represent the brand new designed Permalube gimbal bearing. As you see here, that's pretty darn green, right? And below that, same exact design and new cut to the gimbal bearing. However, the letter B is very important to reference, which is the white dot, not the green dot as shown up above. Again, the white dot right there is the Permalube gimbal bearing that replaces a Permalube gimbal bearing with a green dot. And that is it. That is the end of the service bulletin. And DIYers, again, I wanted to show you that. Here is our specific serial number service manual gimbal bearing with the yellow dot, and that's what we purchased, and that's what we installed. And we'll go all the way back up to the top. And from here, what I want to do is transition outside to the boat where we can talk more about the gimbal bearing and how it will look when it's installed in our transom. Let's go outside and take a look. In the garage now to the back of the boat, as you can see, here's our transom and gimbal ring and trim cylinders. And as we mentioned, our outdrive is fully removed, as well as the gimbal bearing. And inside there, you see a lot of grease. And behind all that grease is your gimbal grease seal. And you can kind of see some little scrapes inside the cavity where the gimbal bearing goes into. And I'll grab the gimbal bearing again. Here's the back side, here's the front side. And that yellow dot, again, 10 o'clock per the service bulletin. And that will go inside here. And because it is sealed and no longer needing grease, what we'll do is we will clean up all that grease and remove it. And for those of you that choose not to go the sealable gimbal bearing, you want to stay traditional with the greasable gimbal bearing, we are going to show you how to remove that internal grease seal. Because if it fails, well, it won't do its job. The main purpose of that seal is to alleviate any grease getting by that seal and into the internal lower portion of your boat, which would get a little messy. So again, that seal does serve a purpose. However, for us, we don't really need to replace that seal. In fact, we don't even need to clean that grease. However, we are going to, and we are going to replace the seal just to show you. And that link will be down below in the comments section as well as description section. And let's feed off of the actual cavity. And in here, you've got the grease hole. Let me give you a better view of it. As you see here, there's some grease just shy of coming out of that hole. And that feeds all the way through this portion right here and then gets to the grease port that you hook your grease gun up to and push grease into the system. And again, going back to the traditional gimbal bearing that is greasable, you will have a gap on this outer adjustable race as shown here, and you want to move this until you make the hole accessible. When it comes time to install the gimbal bearing, that grease hole must be lined up perfectly with that grease hole right there to ensure that when everything's put back together, you can properly grease your gimbal bearing to alleviate premature failure. That would not be fun. So DIYers, that's it. That's all I wanted to show you in this video and discuss in this video. Hopefully this helps. Hey, do us a favor. Below the video, you will see that thumbs up icon. Click on that, like the video, subscribe to the channel. Definitely ring your YouTube bell. That would be very helpful to us. We'd really appreciate it. Thanks again for watching. And if you look way deep inside there, you can actually see the splines inside the engine coupler that is installed on the very bottom and rear portion of our engine.